Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Trial by Jennifer podcast. Again, my name is Jennifer Butterfield, and I'm really excited to have this week's guest, a friend of mine, Claire Stevens, on. And Claire is an estate planning attorney here in the state of Texas. And I just want to say welcome. Thank you so much for coming on, Claire, and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name's Claire Langford Stevens. I am an attorney. I've been practicing for a long time. I don't really want to go into how long it's been. Well, just suffice to say, it's been over 25 years. And when I first started practicing law, I started with estate planning. I was doing it for individuals it was, sort of the beginning or mid of the AIDS crisis. I was doing estate planning for individuals who are HIV positive and kind of got away from that, started doing some other things. And I came back to it a few years ago, probably 2019, I think, and have been set up my own practice and have been doing it ever since.
I love that. I love that. And I love that you kind of had this niche in the beginning and ventured into another area of law and then came back to it. I
Yeah.
feel like estate planning is such a important thing for everyone to have in place, but nobody really
Yes.
wants to consider it.
Nobody wants to think about it. Yeah.
No, they don't. And I am really excited that we have you coming on to share your expertise. And yeah, I'm curious. I asked this to all of my guests on the podcast. Since it is a personal finance podcast, I'm always
Uh-huh.
curious about what was personal finance and the conversation around that like growing up in your home.
Well, my parents were divorced, and my dad was always save, 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 save. And so that was one element of it. The second element was from my mom. And my mom did, I think, the best thing for me, which was really unusual, and I've never heard of anybody else who's had this. She gave me a checking account when I was 12 and
Wow.
I went to the DMV and got my own ID and had my own checking account. And she had gone through the prior year and figured out how much money she was spending on certain things for me.
Wow.
So, you know, I, so she figured out over the year however much she spent on me and gave me that amount of money
Wow.
monthly, divided into 12 months, gave that to me, and that was my money. And I could spend it however I wanted, but I wasn't getting more. So it was very, and thinking about this podcast and thinking about like different things that influenced me and just having watched some other stuff recently, I think there's no substitute for experience. And I'm glad I had that experience starting at 12 or 13, whatever it was. I was young. Um, that I was able to, she said, she used to joke and say, you became a bargain shopper so fast, like your head could spin, because I was instantly like that was my money and I was going to spend it wisely.
Wow. And I don't mean to go off the script, but I'm curious, like, how long did that take you? I mean, were you impulsive with it at first? Like, oh, it's, you know,
No,
so you had this concept of, okay, I gotta be mindful with this. And
yes.
these are for all the things that I need. What kind of things are we talking like? Are we talking about like food expenses, clothing?
No, not food, not like the kind of in
Basic,
my world, the health, education, maintenance, and
right,
support type
right.
stuff. But, I was really into music, so albums. I mean,
Wow.
that was back in the 80s, so it was, buying albums. Um, I went to private school, so she paid for my uniforms, but, like, any clothes I wanted outside of that, I had to pay for.
Which are important when you go to a school and have to wear a uniform.
Yeah. So if I wanted to eat out with my friends, gradually as I got older, go out to eat with my friends, I paid for that. So, when that back in the day, we went to the mall all the time. So any kind of mall expenses, jewelry was big, I paid for all that.
I love that.
Yeah, it was fantastic.
And I see these like banks are coming out with these like credit cards for kids that have
Yes.
their own accounts now. And I don't have kids, but I am like, that is so smart. I love that concept of teaching kids about money young. And you're right
Yes.
about the experience factor. Everything I've learned is, I mean, obviously there's been things that have been handed to me and I've accepted them because I'm grateful, and I've had experiences that, would lead to recognizing the value of
Yeah.
those things being handed to me. But yeah, that's so neat. Thank you for sharing that. I've never heard of anybody else doing that
I've never
either.
heard of
That's
anybody else
wild.
who's done that either. Yeah.
Wow, go mom.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's, I guess, how you kind of learned about money. Is there, I mean, other than that bad experience, has there been like any influential sources or principles or people that
I
you,
really
yeah, go ahead.
really got it from my dad. My mom set that up, and that was really pivotal. But my dad was always, how much are you saving? When I was in my 20s, when are you going to buy a house? Um, let me help you with your 401k. Let's figure out how the money's doing. Are you making enough money off your money?
Right.
Um, how
Wow.
much debt do I have?
Right.
You know, what's your credit rating? All that kind of stuff. I mean, it was just drilled into me at a very young age.
Oh, that's so important and
Yeah.
fantastic. One of the reasons I started this platform, and I share this a lot in my recorded content, but um, financial literacy is so important. And it's oftentimes the people who lack it the most that struggle the most with money, I found. And,
Mhm.
I don't know if my story was just that I didn't listen to my mom, or the presence of financial education and literacy was just not present as much as it could have been. I'm sure there were a number of things, but I've had my own struggles with impulsive spending throughout my life.
Me
And,
too.
it's like, I think that's just kind of the way that my brain and my DNA are wired. And so it's required an immense amount of discipline and like thinking of the long term rather than, this instant gratification that I think
Yeah.
our society is so caught up in.
Yeah.
And I think this is a perfect segue to estate planning because
Okay.
I worked as support in estate planning for several years, and that's why I was so excited to have you come on the podcast because I've seen some horror stories, and I'm sure that you have had some experiences with that as well. And I think we both understand the importance of having affairs in order. And so, congrats on your estate planning practice. And I want to hear a little bit about some of your legal services that you offer and like what the
Okay.
importance of estate planning looks like for you in your mind.
Okay. So let me break that down.
Yeah.
So the importance of it depends on what my clients are looking for. I get some people who come to me who say, I just know that I need a will. I've heard that I need this done. So they don't know anything about anything.
Great.
And then I have people who come to me and say, oh, I want a trust and I want it to look like this. And both of those, my big thing, one of my big things is to have a conversation. There are other estate planning attorneys in my area who will basically hand you a form
Mm,
say, fill this form out, and
mm,
I'll crank out a will,
mm.
and I'll crank out, other documents that we'll get into later, and hand you back something.
Right.
And I don't practice that way. I want to know, okay, so yes, I would say I've never met somebody who didn't need some level of estate planning.
Yeah.
But okay, so you tell me you want to trust. What are you really trying to accomplish with that? What's your real goal? Because there may be a cheaper way than
Yeah.
doing a trust, and a less administratively like cumbersome way to do something. Some people care about different elements that are not necessarily, the finances, but the privacy, or they have land in multiple states. Those different situations can benefit from different resolutions, obviously.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Um, yeah, I'm curious. So I'm really interested in hearing. So if someone were to come, let's just pose a scenario, and I'm going off script a little bit here, but
That's fine.
if someone were to come and like given the first scenario, like they don't have
They don't know anything
anything
about it.
in place, they have no understanding of estate planning, they just have heard it's important, and maybe they have kids. What are like the basic documents that you have seen a need for?
Okay. So, look, the default
Mhm.
is a will,
Right.
last will and testament, the medical power of attorney, the directive to physicians,
Mhm.
and a durable power of attorney.
Mhm.
So those are the four. Sometimes the medical power of attorney is combined with a directive to physicians. So it's either three or four of those basic documents. That's kind of that's sort of my launching pad.
Mhm.
So if they don't, depending on what their goals are, we may decide to do a trust instead of a will. So I don't know if now is a good time to get into the differences, or if we want to do that later.
Let's talk about, yeah, I feel like here we are, right? So
Okay.
let's talk a little bit about like what each of the documents are and their purposes.
Okay. A will basically says that on your death, you want certain things to happen. You want so and so to be your executor. You want, if you have kids, maybe you want to give your kids everything. Maybe you don't. Maybe you have certain items that are special that you want to give to certain people. That's the document that does all of those. A will has to go through probate,
Right.
which is like kind of the sticking factor for some people, because you automatically, if you have a will and you have to have it probated, you're automatically going to go into the court system.
And then it's all public, right? Or it's subject
And
to,
it's
like, if you have debt, and you're transferring assets to someone, it's like, okay, well, those debtors can come after
Yeah,
those assets. So that might not
yeah,
necessarily always be ideal if there are.
yes.
Yeah.
So it's all public after that. You have to have an inventory of your assets. Your creditors get notice
Mhm.
and can get in line to get money out of your estate.
Right.
Um, Whereas with a trust, I think of it as being, do you want to do the work beforehand, or do you want to do the work after? So it's like, are you willing to take on the task of having a trust? Which for a lot of, I would say most people, it's not that it's that complicated. It's just how much bandwidth do you have to absorb that you just have to do things a little bit differently.
Mhm.
The trust is going to be, things are bought and sold within the trust accounts.
Right.
So, one of the things that I remember, and which still kind of is conceptually hard for people to understand, is that there is really, I don't want to say there's no such thing, but the trust isn't a thing, it's an agreement.
Right. It's well, and so when I was working in it, I guess it was established in Old England law, right? And it had to
Yes.
be at least things that had to be in the trust had to be at least the size of a peppercorn.
Yeah. Is that the peppercorn rule?
I
It's
think
been a while
so.
since
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
law.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, okay, well, but so what I'm understanding is like, okay, so I could set up a bank account or like maybe not so much tax deferred assets because I think those kind of have their own like clause in the trust, but like I could set up a bank account or like I could transfer the title of my home, like file a
Yeah.
deed and transfer the name of my home into the title of the trust, right? So
Yes.
like the Jennifer Butterfield management trust agreement or
Yeah.
something. And I would be the grantor, right? I would be the person who creates it.
Yes.
And then there would be a trustee that I would assign, presumably me while I'm alive and competent.
Yes.
Or I could hire somebody like a person at
Yeah.
Wells Fargo, or I could ask if I had a sister and I
Or
trusted
yeah.
her, she was good with money and she wanted to undertake the task of being the trustee, they could serve, right? And ideally you have a couple different people. Okay. And then, but the trust is established for the benefit of someone,
Someone.
someone.
You have trust. So basically you have at least three
Parties.
parties in a trust. You have the trustee, who's the person who manages the trust. You have the beneficiary,
Mhm.
who's the person who gets the benefit from the trust. And then in Texas, you called it a grantor. Some people call it a settlor.
Yes.
So you have the person who creates the trust. Now, I say there are three parties. Depending on what type of trust it is,
Right.
the same person can be all three things.
Right.
So it can get a little complicated, and of course all the language is different from the situation where there's a will, where you have the executor or executrix and beneficiaries. So it's a little bit different, and people use those terms interchangeably. And sometimes I have to back them up and say, okay, when you're saying the trustee, do you want a trust,
Or do
or
you,
are you using that as like sort of a global
right.
term to mean executor or trust, or something else? So,
The distinguishment is really important there.
yes, for a
Because
lawyer it is. For a
absolutely.
lawyer it is.
Yes.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about like, I guess I've heard them called like disability documents and capacity documents. Like what, so, and I know you talked about, your statutory durable power of attorney, medical
Um,
power of attorney, directive to physicians. I know of like the HIPAA waiver,
waiver.
HIPAA.
Yes, thank
For those
you.
of you,
Right. Yes.
I had a professor in one of my classes. He goes, I was talking too much. Get that? I mean, who would have ever thought me talking in class? But he goes, can you even tell me what HIPAA stands for? And I was just like, man, he really got me. All that set aside, let's talk about what each document is and the purpose of it and what is an incapacity document? Am I alive? Am I dead? What's going on there with that?
So I think of those as the end of life planning documents. So incapacity documents, basically they're documents that you need if you're incapacitated.
Mhm.
So for example, my dad is still alive and kicking, and he wanted to redo some of his documents, redo his estate planning documents. So I said, you need I told him we ran through the list of the documents he needs, which he already has, but we're redoing them. Medical power of attorney. These days, people a lot of times do the medical power of attorney with the directive to physicians in one document. So I'll start with the directive to physicians.
It's an important one too.
Yeah, that's basically the document that says whether or not you want to be kept alive if you are in different states of consciousness or
Like if,
incapacity.
yeah, one of them is irreversible and then the other one is terminal, right?
Yes,
And so the difference between those two, I was explained like irreversible is like doctors don't know how long you're going to live. You could live 6 months, you could live 60 years.
yeah,
You're in an irreversible condition, maybe like a coma. And Schreiber, was there a case called, I think, mm, anyway, so yeah, irreversible condition. Do you want to be kept on life support or do you want to be taken off? And like,
yes,
do you want anything for comfort care, like water,
yes,
or morphine or something,
yes,
right?
yes, yeah.
Terminal is like maybe 6 months.
I would, yeah,
The doctors are sure that unless science produces some miracle
miracle.
solution in the next, however long, there is a finite period of time
Yes,
that you are expected to live, and there's absolutely nothing that we have in our possession of medical knowledge to fix this, right?
yeah,
To bring you back to consciousness. Do you want to be kept on or taken off? Is that right?
yes.
Okay. So yeah, so that's the directive to physicians. And you're just sending that direction to the physicians about
Yeah, it's
what,
basically, I can't speak for myself right now, so I'm creating this document that tells the physician what I want in these different situations.
yeah.
So the one that goes with that is the medical power of attorney.
Mhm.
So that gives somebody the ability to act on your behalf
Mhm.
to make medical decisions for you
Right,
if you can't make them for yourself.
right. So like I guess the situation would be like a person's in a car accident
That's what I always that's the example I always give.
and
It's
maybe they're
not
in a coma.
irreversible, it's
Right.
not necessarily terminal, but I can't decide whether or not
Need
I
surgery.
want a certain procedure done.
Right.
So I have, in my documents, I have a couple of different people that I rely on to have the conversation with the doctor
And
to
hopefully
say,
by that point, you've had this conversation with your agents, right?
yes,
And they are clear about what it is you want. And like with this directive to physicians, I would imagine like having to make that decision when you're in that position for another person that you really care about is a huge burden, right? And so it's like
I
to
don't
have
know.
that
I mean,
document in place, I feel like that would be really helpful to be like, oh, look, here,
oh, I
yes.
see what you're
You
saying.
know what
Yes.
I'm saying? Like, I mean, I personally, like, I could not imagine. Thankfully, I know my mom doesn't want to be kept on life support,
Yeah.
but like, I don't know if I would be able to take her off, if it wasn't on a piece of paper, you
Yeah.
know? I
I
mean,
mean, one of the rule that what I always tell my clients is you need to have this conversation and go over what you want very specifically with the people who are listed as your agents.
mhm.
So they know and there's no confusion over, my dad and so my mom passed in 2016 and she had everything in place. It was very easy. I'm also an only child, so that makes things a little bit easier in some respects and more difficult in some respects. But my dad and I have always had a very open dialogue about it. So, even to the extent that there is a book called I'm Dead Now What that I gave him as a Christmas present, which I think is a fabulous book. It tells people what to do. I'm dead. Now what do you do?
Let's link it. We'll link it in the description.
Okay.
Yeah, along with your website. But yeah, that sounds
Okay.
like I love
Yeah,
it.
it's great. Um, so I know he doesn't want to be kept alive. He's
Mhm.
already made all the arrangements. I know we just it, we just have an ongoing, not like every time I see him, dialogue about what to do, but it's like, well, how are things going? Oh, it's good. What, this, that, the other thing. We talk about his finances, his health, and it's just, I know what he wants done.
Mhm.
The conversation
Yeah,
is important.
crucial. Um, yeah, and it's like, I know parts of our brain, not to get too often to the topic of neuroscience, but I've found that it just permeates every area of life. And like
Yes.
our brains are in that state of almost like hypervigilance, like because somebody maybe got into a car accident and they're in a, I mean, it's like they may not be operating at full capacity, but I mean,
Yeah.
they're still able to make decisions. It's still a sound mind, but it's, you know, a lot to try to make decisions for somebody when, and I think that that's, you know, one of the reasons why these documents are so important,
Yeah.
and I love the importance of a conversation because I have been in circumstances and seen people who come to different firms for estate planning and they were treated as though it was like a system, and it's like,
Mhm.
yeah, the system is important and also they're not just another number. Like every familial plan is unique to those individuals. And yes,
Yes.
there are patterns, but to understand the nuances so that none of those things get overlooked, because I think there's probably nothing that could be more disturbing in the grief process than like looking back and being like, oh my gosh, did I do the right thing?
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, okay, so let's move on to the statutory durable power of attorney.
Okay. So that one is the document that gives somebody the right to make what you're more interested in, the financial decisions for somebody else.
Mhm.
So there's a big list. There are a lot of different ways to different things you can add in, take out. A lot of different, it's called the statutory durable power of attorney because it is the basic document is in statute.
Mm,
So you just have to, you can cut and paste it.
yeah,
But depending on the situation, do you want to be able to buy and sell property? Okay, well, then you may need to do this other thing. Do you have to, does it involve a title company? Oh, okay, then there's a different requirement. So there are all these different permutations of what that document can look like. And there are sort of documents that go with that document. So it's not, that's the document that's in statute is a good start.
yeah,
But depending on your situation, you may want it to look a little bit different.
yeah. Which is why the importance of walking through each of those like high
Yes.
powers, right? Like the
Uh-huh.
ability to like make beneficiary designations on behalf of somebody
Yes.
or
I
yeah,
make
like
gifts.
right, gifts, or like maybe they do have a real estate investment portfolio,
Mhm.
you know. Um, yeah, importance of hiring an estate planning attorney
Yeah.
101.
Yeah.
And I think too, it's like, well, hopefully you trust the person enough to name them.
Exactly.
So if you don't trust them now, why would you trust them later down the road, right? So
Exactly.
like there's that
Exactly.
that timing piece.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, logical reasoning, huh?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Do you trust them enough? Because those documents can become effective immediately,
Right,
or they can become effective on incapacity.
right.
And if you have them become effective on incapacity, that makes things a little more complicated because you have to go to a doctor and get the doctor to certify that they're incapacitated.
And that's
Um,
you from what I've understood, you know.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
Um, but if you do it now, people become afraid that somebody's going to take all their money,
Go
or,
to Vegas.
yeah.
But it's
So
like, I mean, what would stop them? Yeah. So hopefully, you know, trustworthy.
hopefully you do trust the person.
Yeah. And you've had a conversation. And also there's what is the word? The fiduciary
You
duty.
have a fiduciary duty.
Yeah. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, when you're the agent for somebody, you can't just go, you can't just, if you're this durable power of attorney, you can't just take their money and go to Vegas. You have a duty, and those duties are outlined in the document. You essentially have to treat it, I'm paraphrasing, obviously. Um, you have to treat it as if it were your own money, or even better.
Right.
You know, you have to, there's an elevated duty that you have to, that relationship creates an elevated duty to that person.
A
So it's
legal,
not,
right?
yeah, it's not just, oh, I'm going to go spend your money. Or I think, John Doe needs a brand new Lexus. It's like John Doe's never going to drive again. He doesn't need a Lexus.
Right.
Um, yeah. So yeah,
Yeah, totally. Okay, so I want to get into like say somebody has created generational wealth, but before we do that, I want to ask, so tell me about some of like the biggest mistakes that you've seen clients make or actions they may fail to take when it comes to personal finances as it relates to estate planning.
personal finances, I think it's really the overall failure to plan. Like, I started planning when the minute I got a job out of law school. I started saving money. And even if you're not saving a lot, saving early is worth a lot.
Time is money, right? I mean, it's
Yes. So, I mean, I don't know the actual numbers, but saving as early as possible is better than saving a lot at the end,
Mhm.
you know? Um, because you basically want to let your money work for you.
At the time value of money and the
Yes.
power of compounding interest and
Yes.
return on investment. I mean, there's a point where you do it right, you can coast into financial independence and retiring early,
Yeah.
and not having to be in a position. I think this is how I define it, success, being able to do whatever you want with your time whenever you want to for as long as you want,
Yeah.
hopefully the intention there is on some level of altruism, right? Because when you've got
Yeah.
all the time, you're hopefully operating from a place of rather than greed, more so this mindset of service. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean it's wild because I am a part of the fire community. I'm on this journey, fire standing for financial independence, retire early. And I see these people who are coasting into FI at like 35. And I'm like, how are they doing that? And
Yeah.
some of it is like economic, being predisposed to economic success by being
Yeah.
like born into generational wealth. But
Yes.
a lot of it is just like having a sharpness around personal finance.
Yes.
And like, I think as wealth becomes increasingly more at the forefront of one's mind,
Mhm.
estate planning is like of equal and greater importance. Because I mean, gosh, especially when you have kids, like I would, and I've seen this where people like, you know, something happens to them and their kids they don't have a way to take care of themselves, or like the people who are responsible for now being those children's guardian, they don't have a way to access those funds or those assets, and like sometimes there's not even like a key to the house,
Yeah.
and I mean, it's like, oh my gosh. But you have those documents in place. You go to the bank, you go to the
Yeah.
or wherever, hopefully those are already on file with those accounts. But
Well,
yeah.
that's another thing I was going to mention. Since a lot of assets,
Mhm.
a lot of personal assets do not pass through the probate process. So things like any kind of, if you have bank accounts, what I do with my clients is sit down and go through their accounts
Right.
and talk about, now, who else is on this account with you? Is anybody on this account with you? Is it a joint account? Is it a joint account with right of survivorship? Is it an account where there can be a beneficiary? Depending on all sorts of different accounts, like you can list them, I won't. But you know, it's all of those pass outside of probate. So if you do decide to get a will and go through the probate process, well, then you still have this kind of stack of stuff over here that needs to be accounted for. So what I do is I say, okay, well, now we have the 401k through so and so. Who's the beneficiary of that? So it's a good time when you're doing your estate planning, it's a good time to go through everything.
Yeah. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about like, so just some of the things like I know, like, gosh, with the way technology is today, I mean, let's talk about the accounts, like passwords, right? Like putting down passwords, or like where is grandfather's jewelry, or like the importance of keeping all of those documents, especially the original will.
Yes.
Can we talk a little bit about the importance of where to keep the original will, and like somebody knowing where it is and it being
Yes.
not where it could get burned down with the house in the event of a
Yeah.
fire? What
Yeah.
happens when there isn't, like they just can't find the will?
Well, it depends. Is there somebody, a lot of people have copies. It
Mhm.
is possible to probate a copy of a will under certain circumstances, but if eventually nobody can, if we think, oh, grandpa had a will back in 1975 and nobody can find it, that's the end of the story.
Yeah.
That's intestacy, which makes me think about one thing that I wanted to mention. You know, part of it, part of the will process, the drafting of that will, is who gets what, right? Who gets what, who does what. But part of it is also avoiding excessive court involvement in your probate. So there are different things that can be written into the will that allow for, it's called an independent administration as opposed to a dependent administration, which decreases the amount of court involvement in the probate process. So I always, if I'm looking at somebody's will, that's the first thing I look for. The second thing I look for is a self-proved affidavit,
Mhm.
so that you don't have to have witnesses come to the courthouse to prove up the will. There's a
Right.
thing called self-proved affidavit, which most attorneys do. Um, but those are like the two kind of key, like those are the first two hurdles. Then you get into like the nitty-gritty of what the will actually says. But those are like the two big things. And those are the two things that the general public isn't aware of. And if you're using some kind of like legal Zoom or something like that, there's no guarantee that that language is put into your will. So
Right.
it may have that first part of who gets what and who does what, but it's not necessarily going to have the part that says, oh, by the way, I don't want the court involved in every decision.
Right.
I want to leave that up to my executor.
Right.
And I don't want witnesses to have to come to the courthouse to prove up my handwriting on the will.
Right.
So yeah, those are two important things. That's why I'd say even if you just have the bare bones will, that it's worth it to just, you know, for those two reasons alone.
Yeah, hiring an attorney. Well, and I think too, like when you say the is involved, like I'm trying to put myself in this position, right? Where I'm grieving the loss of someone, right?
Yes.
And maybe we can't find the will, or maybe the will isn't written according to
Uh-huh.
the preferences, right? And so
Uh-huh.
now all of a sudden, that case gets filed, the probate begins, and then the court starts delegating assets or whatever it may be to people that maybe, that wasn't the will of the person when they
Yeah.
died, and like the lack of control
Yes.
in that, and like just honestly terror, which is why people don't want to think about this stuff, and that's the conundrum, is because it's that important that you need to think about it so that you don't have to go through all that. But it is hard when you're looking around at all the things that you've amassed throughout a lifetime and said, oh, well, who's gonna get this when I'm gone?
Yeah.
And what are they gonna do with all this stuff?
Yeah.
Like, how do I have that conversation of like, hey, do you mind taking my cats if something
Yeah.
happens to me, like taking care of them for the rest of their lives, kind of a thing? It's like,
Yeah.
um, yeah, wow.
There's a trust for that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. There's actually a show about a trust for that. Gunther.
Oh,
Have you
Gunther's
seen
Lake.
that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh gosh. It's
Yeah, that's a little crazy.
it
Like,
is. It is. It's a
more than
wild
a little
show.
crazy. But I've done a couple pet trusts.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. It's just a lot of it is just getting people to think about what they want to do. It's not, it's just that, like, I don't want to think about death. I don't want to think about dying. I don't want to think about that. The superstition of, like, I don't want to think about my own demise because I'm going to bring it upon myself.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
um, it's just that overall avoidance that people, the fear, it's all fear, right?
Well, and I think it goes into this bigger conversation of like, well, what happens when we die, to our waking consciousness? And that's a huge Pandora's
Yeah.
box to open, but it's like, I think that's where a lot of the fear comes from. And I mean, that's
Oh,
obvious.
yeah, it's unknown. People
It
fear of the
is.
unknown.
And,
So,
I'm curious, like as far as, let's see, oh, say somebody, okay, somebody is coming up in the world, they come from nothing, right? They're starting
yeah.
to build wealth, right? For themselves, their money's working for them, they've accumulated assets. But say, the generation before them, died a pauper, right? And
Yeah.
they've
So they're coming in with nothing.
they made it on their own, they don't know anything, and then they've got children, and they want to make sure that the transfer of wealth goes smoothly.
Uh-huh.
what what does that look like in your mind? I know it's going to depend, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of like maintaining financial health overall, I know that they say like by the third generation, like some abhorred percentage of wealth has been spent or gone,
Yeah.
and so can we talk about that? And then also like sibling rivalry, like the difference between
Oh,
like, individual trusts versus like a pot trust, and
yeah.
yeah.
Um, so I think you sort of answered the first part of that question, which is like I think the simplest way is to put it in trust, to keep the general, the trust allows for a smoother transition because, I mean, for a lot of people who don't understand, when you have a trust, there's no court involvement unless there's a challenge to the trust or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, but when you set up a trust, you name the trustee, and then you say if that tree, fails or ceases to serve, then we have another trustee. So it's a smoother transition. Um, Most of the work is done just administrating the trust. And there are several books out there on that and articles that I have on that. Um, but that's going to be your smoothest way, the easiest way to transfer that wealth generation to generation. There are other generation skipping trusts. There are, I mean, there are a lot of different kinds of trusts.
It's a wild world out there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is. It's like the Wild West. It really is.
Yes.
Um, so when I started doing this, people be like, well, that's a such and such trust. And I'm like, I have no idea what that is. What is that? And a lot of it, once you think about it, it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense, but you just didn't know the name.
Right.
Or it's like, oh, that's this. Oh, okay. I got it now.
Pilots and biddits and all
Yeah,
these different, it's like,
all the
what?
acronyms.
Right.
But I think the smoothest way to transfer wealth, the second way would be through a will, but then you're going to have potentially different tax implications. Trusts are better at avoiding taxes. Um, Wills, you basically are transferring assets in between people in like a more kind of rigid way, where a trust is more fluid. And there are different, and then on top of that, even like transferring, I mean, most people, like, their biggest asset is their house. And there are different ways of transferring houses as well, through different types of deeds. So, and those are smoother than doing it through a will and probate. But again, I have 2 kids.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily have the bandwidth. If you have small children, you may not have the bandwidth to be managing or administering a trust.
Right. It's like running a business.
It is.
Yeah.
So depending on what your assets look like, it could be its own business.
Mhm.
But if you say, I'm gonna put my house and I'm gonna do a transfer on death deed, oh, okay, well, that's much simpler. And then if I die, it just goes to so and so. Perfect. Without having to get the court involved.
Right.
There are just so many, um, there are just so many options.
Yeah.
And of course, the more convoluted things get, the more expensive they are.
Right.
So, you may have, one of the benefits of doing of trust is privacy. There could, because they don't get filed with the court. So you can keep your information private. Now, I've had clients who really didn't have, in the big scheme of things, a lot of assets, but privacy really mattered to them.
Right.
So they wanted a trust.
Right.
And like I mentioned earlier, if you have, we border however many states, 5 states here in Texas. If you have land in Louisiana or land in Oklahoma
Mhm.
or, New Mexico, if you have land in various states, a trusted makes it a lot easier than having to do probate here and then ancillary probate in another state.
Right.
So it really depends on the circumstances with the specific person or family.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, this is such a wealth of information. I'm so excited for our
Okay.
listeners to get to hear all of this. And, I think one of the things that I remember being hot topic in estate planning with the sibling rivalry. It's like, well, okay,
Oh, sibling rivalry,
yeah,
yeah.
it's like, well, I have 3 kids. Why wouldn't I just split it in thirds, right? Like whatever
You
assets
will.
I have. I mean, I think that can be beneficial, but it's like, again, here's like the nuance, right? Because say I've got one child that has a medical condition,
Yeah.
and it
Or you know, in the world I come from, like I deal with a lot with people who have addiction issues
right,
or mental health issues.
right,
Because of that, maybe someone has a mental health issue. They don't necessarily need a specific trust set up. There's a specific trust called a special needs trust.
right,
Maybe they're not disabled under federal law, but maybe they need some extra help. So, you know, maybe they need a 60-40 split, or
right.
maybe they're still in active addiction, and you don't want them to have
Access to it, but you want them
access
to
to a
have
big
access
chunk
to
of
it.
money
Right,
so they can go kill themselves, you
right.
know?
Yeah,
Um, it can look a lot of different ways. So one thing that I've been asked multiple times is, you know, people want to know, do they have to do it a certain way? Do I have to give it all? You know, I have 2 kids. Do I have to make it a 50-50 split? No. You can
no,
do whatever you want. It's your money.
right.
They're your assets. Um, you know, do I have to give anything to someone? You know, there are
Yeah,
different strategic ways to handle those types of situations,
right,
but we can handle it the way I can handle it the way my client wants me to handle it 99.9% of the time.
right. I think that's the beauty and complexity of having, an understanding of the law, especially in this area. And it's such an intimate thing with estate planning, I think, versus the other areas of practice. So I love hearing all of this. I think it's so beneficial. I want to mention, I know you brought up your boys, and yeah, I'm just curious, like if there's anything in terms of advice, considering their generation and knowing all that you know today, what would that look like? And also like how are you talking to your kids about personal finance and money, and what does that look like for you as a parent?
Well, I don't. My older son is 15. He has an innate sense like he's going to be okay. He has an innate sense of taking care of his money. He's really good at getting people to spend their money and saving his money,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
which is a skill. Like, God bless him.
Mhm.
Um, he's a saver. He's got a lot of money saved for his age. My little one is 10, almost 11. He is more like his mama. He likes new shiny things.
Mhm.
And, you know, this is the kid who, when he started kindergarten, told me that he wanted fancy clothes. So he still has that streak. I think it's about, with like most things in life, it's about balance. It's
Mhm.
about saving your money, but also teaching them that, you know, sometimes it's okay. Sometimes you want a new pair of shoes and I'm not going to buy it for you. Sometimes that's okay too. Do you need a new pair of shoes every time, you know, new Air Jordans come out? No,
Right.
you don't. Um, but, you know, once in a while, is that okay? Yeah, it's okay. But, you know, one of the things when I was thinking about preparing for this
Mhm.
is, you know, the one of the things that my parents drilled into me was to live within my means.
Yeah,
And I think that is so important
so crucial.
because, you know, when I was growing up, I knew how to balance it. I balanced a checkbook
The
on paper
lost
with a
skill.
calculator.
Yeah, Yeah.
And now so much of everything is digital,
Yeah.
and you have Cash App and Apple Pay and a bank account and a credit card.
Amazon and
Yeah, and
it's
it's complicated to to keep track of everything.
it's-
But don't if the, I mean, I stress to not let that get ahead of you.
yeah.
Don't let your keep track of your finances, develop a budget and stick to it,
Yeah. No,
which is hard.
it is in this day and age, and especially with the rising cost of living matched
Yes.
wage stagnation. And I think, um,
Yes.
I've been reading, I'm starting a master's degree in business analytics, and one of the courses is on AI. Um,
Uh-huh.
this is totally, tangent, but um, I've been reading here and there. It's like, you know, branding your personal name and your presence is like
Mm,
AI is not going to be able to take that away from us. So that's good,
yeah.
and yeah, I like it's a lot to keep track of. And I think that
Mhm.
learning those skills, and I still do my budget by pen and paper too. Like I'll pull out
I'm a paper person.
90 days of expenses, and I'll try to do it once a week, and I'll sit down on Sundays and okay, here's my rent, here's the car payment, the car insurance, and all these things. And then I'm like, okay, I just did a bit on how much I'd spent at Starbucks this
I
year.
saw that.
Like
I saw the Starbucks.
five
That's
hundred
just,
dollars and that's like $1,000 a year that's going to coffee, which doesn't
yeah.
even like
Well,
sit well with me anymore. So I'm
yeah.
like, so I've been making my coffee at home, and man, it's wild because I'm not watching my bank account go down. And I'm like, this is what
Well, when I was in law school, I would bring my lunch. Like I was broke. I
yeah,
didn't take out loans for law school.
right.
Fortunately, I mean, this was, 30 something years ago. My parents paid for my law school, and this was before tuitions went sky high.
It's insane.
But I had I did not take out loans. I
Wow.
had very limited resources. So I wasn't going to pay a dollar for a Coke. I mean, back then it was a dollar probably, you know? It's like, I'm going to buy a 12 pack. I'm going to bring my Coke to school with me.
Yeah.
I'm not going to buy lunch at the cafeteria. I can make it cheaper. And that's one of those things that was just drilled into me at such a young age. It's second nature now. Every time I go to Starbucks, I'm like, this is $5 down the drain.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's worth it.
It
Sometimes
is.
it's not.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, again, here comes that part of the conversation about balance.
Yeah,
And I think, you can really tell a lot about a person by where their money goes, like what
yeah,
their values are based on what their spending looks like. And I think it takes mindfulness and discipline, because I think so much of our culture is consumed by this mentality of disposability and
yes,
instant gratification, and we get that dopamine hit from
yeah,
spending money and getting the new thing. And when I was working on my undergraduate degree, I was in a corporate social responsibility course,
mhm,
and we watched this video, and I'll have to go back and find it, but it's on just the way that things are made these days are
yeah,
not the same quality that they were 50 years ago.
no,
They were made to last maybe 6 months, so that it's planned obsolescence, right? I mean,
yes,
with our phones. And so again, here's like this culture that's feeding us this
yeah,
consume, and it takes discipline, it takes rewiring our neural pathways to find that source of dopamine elsewhere. And I get it now from like going to make my coffee in the morning instead of running down the street to go to Starbucks and buying the $7 latte that I
yeah.
love. Um, and so yeah, I am just so grateful to have had you on. Like, just thank you so much for coming. I know your time is so
Pleasure.
valuable, and I love that your mission is to help people get their affairs in order. It's so, so important. And I'm so glad that hopefully by talking about this, it has made it less scary for some people who are
I
getting,
hope so, because it's
and
really not.
it's
It's
not.
really not. It's not. The anticipation is worse than the actual, like, sitting down with me and talking about everything.
Well, and I think you're there to walk them through the process. You've got experience and knowledge, in helping identify the solution that's going to be best for them. So I just want
Yes.
to say thank you so much for
You're
coming on the
welcome.
podcast. It has been such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you all for listening. Again, this has been another episode of the Trial by Jennifer podcast. And next week, I'm very excited to have our guest, Kevin Geringer, come on to talk about how he has built generational wealth for himself as a first generational wealth builder, and talk about his favorite ways to save money. And I think we're actually going to get into a lot of this same philosophy of mindfulness around spending. So I'm really excited to have him on, and I hope you'll tune in then. And thank you all so much for listening. I'll see you next week. Hi, Trial by Jennifer listeners and viewers. This is Jennifer Butterfield, your host. And if you liked this episode, please tune in next Wednesday, August 9th at 10 a.m. Central Time. I am going to be hosting Alexis Jimenez from Betty Lash Spa here in Austin, Texas. And we're going to be exploring the pressures put on women to look and feel beautiful and what impact that has had in this self-care beauty industrial complex. And we're also going to be evaluating, the philosophy of consumerism and what impact this pressure on women has had on the beauty economy as a whole. And I'm really excited to host her on the show because she not only is a consumer in the industry, but she also works in the industry. And so aside from that, we will also be covering what it looks like to manage money as a 21-year-old living in a very high cost of living area. So be sure to tune in. And if you found this episode helpful, do subscribe to my YouTube channel and follow me on Spotify. And I will see you all on Wednesday of next week. Looking forward to it.